I want to call your attention again to Matthew, the 14th chapter, verses 12 through 21. Scripture writer begins the text by recalling the death of John the Baptist. John the Baptist has just been murdered, executed by King Herod. And where we pick up our text this morning, the disciples of John the Baptist pick up his body and they bury it. And they go and tell Jesus. Scripture says that when Jesus heard this news, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desert place to be by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot. Gospel according to John says that they ran after him. And when he went ashore, Matthew says Jesus saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desert place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowd away so that they may go into the village and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to his disciples, they need not go away. In fact, he gets indignant with his disciples and he says to them, "You give them something to eat." They replied to Jesus, "Well, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." And so Jesus ordered the crowd to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed, broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 basketfuls. And those who ate were 5,000 men, besides women and children. This morning, this text highlights for us the work of discipleship. The work of discipleship. Yesterday, as I was meeting with the Mission Outreach Committee, we were talking about the various mission projects that we would be implementing throughout this year as a congregation. I'd asked them as a team, I asked them to highlight for me what they saw their purpose as a ministry. They sat and they discussed what they saw as their purpose, and they said to serve. Others said to listen. And then not only to listen, the caveat was given that when you listen, you have to understand. Got to have a form of empathy. And then one word was spoken as we started talking about areas in the Bible that Jesus demonstrated this type of work. We looked at Galatians 6, where Paul reminds the church of Galatia to bear each other's burdens. We looked at Matthew 25, where Jesus says, if you see those who are thirsty, give them something to drink. If you see those that are naked, clothe them, And then somebody said, well, we have to look at the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, I've read this text plenty times before. I knew the text, but one word stuck out in the text that caught my attention on yesterday, and it was that word compassion. See it in our scripture this morning in verse number 14. Jesus had compassion. King James Version says Jesus had compassion on them. Sat there and I listened in, and I was paying attention. I really was. I was paying attention. But while the meeting was still going on, that word was still on my head, compassion. Now, just to be honest and sincere with you, at that moment, I really did get frustrated with God because I had already had my sermon prepared. But when I heard the word compassion, it struck me. I said, Lord, what are you trying to show us, especially as we are talking about this work of discipleship, as we are trying to show people that we are called as believers to follow after God and to follow after God's will, and that we are to be living a life that is consistent with the teachings of Christ, and that this call to life is not a life of duplication, but a life of imitation, which calls us to love others as Christ loves us. And there it was. Hit me. That compassion stuck out because it highlights for us the love that Christ has for us and the love that we should have for one another. This self-giving love, this sacrificial love, this self-forgetting love, this humbling love, this potentially painful love. What do you mean, Pastor? Potentially painful. It's a love where you are called to serve others more than you serve yourself. A love that causes us to ask the question every single day we wake up: can we love in a way that calls us to be obedient to God, even when we don't want to? Now, how does this text show us that? Well, believe it or not, the scripture highlights that that's the challenge that Jesus faces. Jesus is confronted with this question in our sermonic text because the gospel reveals that Jesus is confronted with the needs of the people at a very difficult time in his life. You see, unfortunately, when we hear the story of the 5,000, the feeding of the multitude, when we hear this story, we only focus on the miraculous event of Jesus taking those loaves and those fish and then multiplying it. We only highlight on him taking little and to turning it into much. But the thing that we tend to overlook is the context for which Jesus performed this ministry in. See, the text reveals to us in chapter 14 at verse number 12 that the disciples of John the Baptist had just come to tell Jesus that John the Baptist had died. Now, what was so important about this text? You see, just before Jesus begins feeding this crowd, just before he heals their sick, just before he comforts those who may be mourning themselves, the text lets us know that Jesus was getting ready to run away from the people. The text says that he wanted to be by himself. He wanted to get away from the demands of ministry. You see, Jesus was seeking to retreat from those who had a need because he himself had his own need. What do you mean, Pastor? He had his own need. Jesus was grieving. Look at the text. The scripture reveals his cousin. That's who John the Baptist is, if you don't know. That's his cousin. His cousin. But not only his cousin, his friend. But not only his friend, his spiritual mentor. This is the very man who told the nation, prepare ye the way of the Lord. man he probably admired, man he looked up to, a man he shared in the ministry with, somebody he was close to. This was his cousin, for goodness sake. He's told that his cousin has just died. And then what complicates the issue, church, is that John the Baptist does not die of natural causes. No. He was not sick. This was not a unexpected death. No. John the Baptist was in prison. He was in prison for preaching the gospel. But in a moment, he went from being a living ward of the state to being an innocent victim of execution. Yes, an innocent victim of execution, because if you read in the 14th chapter, verses 1 through 12, you would see that King Herod was throwing a good old party. And one of the party guests had done a spectacular dance for King Herod, and King Herod, filled with admiration for this woman, said, "What do you want me to do?" She said to him, "Put John the Baptist's head on a plate." Kills John the Baptist without cause. Kills him without a trial. And then the word gets to Jesus. So, in this moment, when Jesus finds the news, he's seeking to escape, seeking to retreat. But the scripture reveals that when the people got wind of where Jesus was going, they decided that they had to follow him too. They decided to follow him not knowing what he was going through. They decided to follow him because all they could see was their needs and not his needs. Now, the text does not include the exact distance that Jesus was traveling. However, Jesus, when he found out the news, he was probably still in Nazareth. You gather this from Matthew the 13th chapter, where Jesus was preaching in the synagogue in his own town, and his own home folk told him, "Boy, stop that preaching." So there he gets the word that his cousin has died, and now he is trying to go from Nazareth to Bethsaida. Now, if you look at a map, you would understand that Nazareth is on one side of the Sea of Galilee, and where he was going was on the other side of the sea. Now, the text tells us that he was traveling by boat, but the people followed him on foot. That means that they had to walk the banks of the sea, traveling almost over 20 miles to get where Jesus was going. Meaning that those that chose to follow Jesus walked the distance. Jesus was trying to get away in his grief, trying to flee from the people, but yet the people in their desperation were still trying to get to Jesus. Just imagine for a moment the emotions that Jesus must have felt. See, church, I'm trying to get us to stop sanitizing Jesus. Jesus was a person like you and me. He had feelings and emotions like you and I. He went through the same things that we had gone through. He was not just this superhuman. So imagine the grief on him when he debarked from this boat, saw the awaiting crowd. He sees people in their desperation, people who are crying out to him, "Please heal me." People who are saying, "I saw what you did in the past. Can you do it for me too?" All the while he's still grieving. He's hurting. He's baffled. He wants to withdraw, but yet there's folk that says, "We need you." It's right to say, believe it or not, it's right to say that Jesus would have every right to be annoyed given his emotional state. You know, when you want to retreat and it seems like you can't get away because somebody always calling your phone, somebody's always knocking on your office door. You just want some time to yourself, and it seems like the very minute that you want that time to yourself, that means everybody else has a problem. and then they want you to prioritize their problem ahead of your problem. Come on, somebody. So imagine the emotions that Jesus feels in this moment. So he has every right. He would have had every right to be annoyed. In fact, he would have had every right to get back on that boat and to travel right back down to Nazareth. But what Jesus shows us in this moment, in the moment that he gets off the boat and he begins to see the people, what Jesus demonstrates to us is that when we accept the call to discipleship, when we begin the work of discipleship, we must be willing to serve even when we must bear our own crosses. I'm be heavy this morning. But we must be willing to work even when we have to bear our own crosses. It was Jesus who had taught his disciples. He had just told them, he said, that whosoever does not pick up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. See, Jesus shows us that our crosses, they're never some little burden that we can just put away. They're never just any form of inconvenience. No. The cross you bear, the cross that we are called to bear, tend to be those shameful, painful, and sorrowful experiences that sometimes make us feel so debilitating that we don't want to do anything. I don't know about you, but maybe I'm the only one with a cross. To know that my cross sometimes causes me just to want to retreat, to be by myself and to be in the midst of my hurt, because I recognize that sometimes the crosses are those close relationships that tend to hurt the most. But Jesus calls us to work, not disregarding those experiences. No. Not acting as though they are not real. Instead, he calls us to work, recognizing them and moving forward despite those experiences. See, that's the beauty of the faith. The beauty of the faith is that you can take the hurt you are going through right now and recognize that God can give you the strength to work through it all. You can take the pain, the sorrow, the shame, the guilt you may bear. You can take all of those things and lay it in the master's hands so that you might do the work that God calls you to do. It reveals to us that our faith is strong regardless of the conditions we bear. What do you mean, Pastor? Deacon Pernetta, it brought so much power to me when I heard that word compassion, because knowing the state of Jesus. You see, such power is brought to the text when you can imagine Jesus with his red rim eyes and tear-stained cheeks, healing the sick. You can imagine the power of the text and the passion that Jesus must have for these people when you can see his trembling hand touching those that need his power. You can imagine the power of the text when he looks upon a woman who might be grieving, and yet he's grieving too, and still says, "Peace be upon you. Pick up your bed and walk." See the power and the beauty of the text. You can see the revelation that is given, that when you can see that out of his own scarcity, out of his own emotional lack, Jesus can take the lack of society and the lack of what was presented in the text and yet multiply it that it might feed 5,000. He's broken, yet he breaks. He's broken, yet he breaks and blesses so that others might be healed. So you see this image, you cannot read this image ever the same again, because it is overflowing with love. A love that is sacrificial, a love that is self-forgetting, a love that is humbling. When Jesus is confronted with the needs of the people, he has compassion on them. I like that phrase, compassion on them. That phrase stands out because it paints a different picture. Most people would have said compassion for them. But Jesus does not just have compassion for them, he has compassion on them. What this picture paints for me, it's literally, he takes the hand of God, the tangible hands of God. He being God takes his hands and places them on people and places that compassion upon them so that they might experience the presence of Almighty God. What I'm trying to get you to understand, church, is that our role as disciples, we just can't have compassion for people. We got to learn how to have compassion on some folk. That means we have to move outside of our comfort zone, stop staying in our sanitized walls and get down into the muck and mire and walk with those that need to feel the presence of God so that when they feel our touch, they can feel the hand of Jesus. So Jesus does not just have compassion for them, but he places compassion on them. So through the healing of the sick, the tending to their needs, he lets the people know God is here. And I wonder how many in the world need to know that God is with them in the midst of their situation. You see, the work of discipleship always allows us, here it is, to be used as the hands of God, that we might place our hands on others, that they might know that God is there with them. You see, we don't serve this absent type of God. We serve a God who is always present. And in the first century church, this was a concept that was very foreign for them. Just think about who Jesus is walking with. He's walking with a Roman society of people who are known, that know of pagan gods, gods that sit on a mountain way up, far away from the people, gods that tend to use people as their toys and their pawns. And yet Jesus is coming on the scene to say to them that the God I serve is not a God that uses you to manipulate you, but it's a God that uses you to bless somebody else so that they might be able to see the love and mercy of the Most High God. Serve a God who cares about the oppressed. Serve a God who cares about the downtrodden. This God was one who, in a world that knew the meaning of food scarcity, took little and multiplied it into much, revealing that to the people that even in the most impossible situations, God is still able to perform life-giving miracles. But look what he does, and I'm through. Jesus took the little, tells the disciples, he says, bring those 5 loaves, those 2 fish, bring them to me. He took the little. He broke it. And he blessed it. And then passed it to the disciples. And then the disciples shared it to the people. Don't let that pass you by. Look at it again. Look at it again. He took the bread. Took the bread. He blessed it. He broke it. And then he gave it to his disciples. He took it. He blessed it. He broke it. And then he gave it to his disciples. He took the little that they had. He took their weaknesses. He took the scarcity. He took the lack. And he raised it up to heaven. And he blessed it, allowing them to know that what you may think is a little is still enough. Showing them that even when you don't think you have enough, I can bless it so that it is enough. He took it and he blessed it. And then if that wasn't bad enough, he took their very little and then broke it some more to show them that even when you think this is enough, I can break it again to show you that I have the power to take brokenness and heal people, to show you that I have the power to take brokenness and turn about transformation, to show you that I have the power to take brokenness and use it for my glory. And then after he broke it, he gave it. Gave it to his disciples. Oh my God, he gives it to his disciples in order that his disciples might be used by God, because what he says to them, he says, I cannot do the work all by myself, but I need a remnant of folk who can take what I bless and use it for the glory of God. He takes it, he breaks it, and he blesses it, he passes it on. And then the disciples have to take what he's given them and give it to somebody else. I just need to stay here one more minute, because he takes what he's already broken. Now the disciples know he don't have much in the first place, and he takes what he breaks. And then he gives it to his disciples. Now, the disciples were the very ones that told him, man, you need to send these folk home, because we don't have enough to feed them in the first place. You need to go ahead and tell them to go on about their merry way and buy them some food. But when Jesus says, no, we cannot send them away, he says that to them because he recognizes if we don't have the food for them, the cities that they came from didn't have the food for them. And then he breaks it and gives it to his disciples. And in that moment of giving it to his disciples, he shows us that when we are in the work of discipleship, we have to remove ourselves from a position where we are barriers of God's will and we become vessels of God's will. Because the flip side of the text is the disciples could have taken that piece of bread and fish and ate it for themselves. Because there are some of us right now that we take what God gives us and we don't use it to be a blessing for somebody else because we believe that it's not enough to be a blessing, so we keep it for ourselves. But what the text says is that if you have enough faith in God to take the little that he gives and uses it for somebody else, he blesses it and multiplies it so that everybody has more than enough. So the disciples could have been barriers. In fact, in the beginning, they were barriers. They said, man, send them home. But what Jesus shows them is this ultimate important truth, is that you and I can never feel the hearts of people unless we allow Christ to first fill our hands with a blessing that's never intended for us, but is intended to be given to somebody else. And the question that I have is, how many of us are holding on to what God has already broken, trying to keep it for ourselves because we don't believe we have enough? God blesses us and simply says, use it to be a blessing to somebody else. But yet, when we get the broken blessing, let me put it in real terms for you, church. When we get that paycheck and it subtracts the taxes out of it, the government has gotten theirs, we feel we don't have enough for our own self. But God says, if I've given it to you, I can multiply it so that you can make sure that everybody has enough. We live in a world where we live in a government of democratic values. We live in a democratic society. And yet we now have a legislature that says we don't have enough money to pay our bills. But the reason why we don't have enough money to pay our bills is because we got too many politicians in Washington getting rich off of the money that you send to Washington instead of using what you send to be a blessing to somebody else. Thus the reason why they can justify not giving 9 million children health insurance. Thus the reason why they can justify making sure that senior citizens don't get their Social Security check. Thus the reason why they can justify the mess that they are doing, because they are always trying to say, we don't have enough, but we serve a God who can take our little, break it into much more, and use it so that people... So, when he's confronted with the needs of the people, he says, feed them. He has compassion on them. But his followers say, put them on the back burner. We got to care for ourselves. You know why? Because that was the easiest thing to do. Discipleship is always hard work. It's not going to be easy. Leadership, you have to hear this, discipleship is never going to be easy. So the question may arise, do we hoard this money for ourselves, or do we use it to do ministry, knowing that when we do ministry, we are making an investment in the community that God blesses and multiplies? The issue that we have is that we don't understand God's math. You can't apply human logic to God's power. You'll never make sense of it. To you, 1 + 1 is 2. But to God, 1 + 1 is 5,022. Because God can take the one and break it enough that it is enough substance for somebody that they have more than enough. And the text makes it clear that after the Lord gets finished doing what he's doing, they have an abundance of resources that everybody can take a to-go plate home. And in the end, you see, we shout off the 5,000, but the 5,000 was just the men. You don't know how many children were out there. And we come from a people, you know our folk, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. Then it's not like modern day society where we have 1 and 2. This is a time where there's about 23 of them jokers traveling along, and yet everybody had enough to eat. Everybody had enough resources. What God does in this miracle is that he shows us, despite our skepticism, because we are those disciples. That's us. We are the ones that often say, it's time to send them home. That's us. Feed who? That's us. With what? That's us. Do what? How many folk you say? I counted 5 pieces. And it's 12 of us. And you trying to feed 5,000 of them? That's us. But what he shows us is that when we are skeptical of God performing miracles, when we are skeptical of how God can make ways, when we become skeptical, he shows us that we have to move past our skepticism and look with an eye of compassion. Move past your skepticism and look with an eye of compassion, because this is what Jesus saw when he saw those people. He looked at the people who had walked the distance. while he had traveled in a boat. He looked at a people who had to go up the mountainous terrain in shoes that probably did not fit their feet. He looked at a people who carried their sick from where they were to where he was right now. And too often, we remain in our seats of privilege, not recognizing that our privilege blinds us from compassion. When you can put aside your privilege and look at the person who stands in need, it's the love that you have for them that will compel you to do something about their problem. The one thing that I love about the meeting yesterday that was evidently clear was that the words were say, Pastor, we can't serve people if we don't know how to love people. Pastor, we can't tell people about Jesus if we don't know how to give them a piece of bread when they're hungry. Pastor, we cannot evangelize the folk if they are in need of something. We as a community have to come together and make the sacrifice to help our brothers and sisters and know that when we help them, they then will see that there is a God somewhere, that there is a God who cares about my condition, that there is a God who loves me no matter what I'm going through, that there is a God that has compassion upon me, that has compassion on me, that lets me know that he is Emmanuel, God with us, that no matter what I am going through, he walks with me, he talks with me, he loves me, he shows me that there is a better way. That's the message of discipleship. That's the challenge of discipleship. And it ain't easy. It's hard work. It's hard work. And yet, he pushes us to do it because he loves us. And he commands us. He commands us. Reverend Carney, he commands us. You know what he commands us? He don't command us to come to church on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. That's not his command. His command is not to dress in your best attire and show off your best hat when you come in. That's not his command. His command is simple. Love one another as I have loved you. That's it. That's it. That's it. That's it. And here it is, church. In the midst of this political chaos, we are in a position now to show people what love really looks like. It's by no accident that you have turmoil in Raleigh. It's by no accident you got turmoil in Washington. It's by no accident. No accident that people are on furlough. It's by no accident. By no accident. This is all by God's plan to see if the same people that call out his name are willing to serve them when they're confronted with need. This is a challenge for us. And the question that the Lord is asking is, what are you going to do when somebody who is a part of your fellowship is out without a job because of what's happening in D.C.? What are you going to do? Are you just going to say, I'll pray for you? Or are you going to lend a helping hand to be there for somebody, to do the best you can, to cook a meal when you can? Make sure that they have clothes. What are you going to do when that homeless person is on the street corner holding up that sign? Are you just going to turn your head? Or are you going to bless them with that care package, knowing that it will cause you to come out your comfort zone? I don't want to talk to them. That's what we say. They might be dangerous. We come up with all types of rationales as to why we won't do what needs to be done when confronted with a need. But if you're dedicated to this work of discipleship, you'll push beyond that and have compassion on them. And even when you're bearing your own cross, even when you don't know how your bill's going to get paid, you can still do the work of the Lord. That's what real discipleship is all about. Won't you stand all over the sanctuary? I am challenged